there was this other really fun study that basically asked this really wide range of adults there was a continuum with birth on one end and death on the other. And they asked them to just put an X on that line where they feel like they are. And it was like a really wide range, like, I don't know, like 20 to 80 or something. And it was like almost, it didn't really matter how old the person was. Almost everyone put the X like in the middle. So
Lyla Rothschild works for the Ernest Becker Foundation. As an undergrad, after coming across a quote from Becker in some class reading, she was intrigued, and after checking it out and finding it came from Becker's book, The Denial of Death, she has never looked back. Lyla has a particular interest in understanding the motivations behind prejudice, tribalism, culture and culture conflict, which of course led her to completing her senior thesis on terror management theory. You may have seen one of the founders of TMT on the show before, Sheldon Solomon. Basically, nearly everything Lyla does is around the subject of death and the subjects that we have been discussing here on the show. In this episode, we talk with Lyla about her work with the Ernest Becker Foundation, how maybe our brain isn't actually built to be able to deal with the knowledge of our own mortality, and how we can actually use our knowledge and self-awareness of our own death in ways that are adaptive rather than maladaptive in trying to build a better life for all. Towards the end of the show, we talk about our coping mechanisms and how it's not about all coping mechanisms being bad, but about learning to use more conscious, rational processes in tackling our fears of death. And of course, a lot of this is feeding into the global situation right now with COVID-19. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, please sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. It would also be a massive help to us if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can do right now simply by clicking the subscribe button below. So settle in for this episode now, Illusion of Safety.
One thing that was interesting to me is, what brought you to touch this subject of death, because you're quite young, Kirsten. We are old, as you can see, so just like...
Oh yeah, so old. No, but...
just like interesting for us, like how did you end up in this Ernest Becker Institute, Foundation, sorry.
I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to note as well is that I didn't have any sort of traumatic experiences with death early on, or even just regular experiences with death. I was just a weird existential kid who was very acutely aware of mortality from a very young age. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but my parents tell this story that there was this period of days when I was maybe about 6 or 7 years old where I was just completely inconsolable and crying and really upset for several days on end, probably more like 1 day and a half, but that's concerning at that point that it's not stopping. And they would keep asking what was wrong, and I would just say, I don't know, I'm just sad. And so they kind of would let it go, but it started to get, probably the second day they were really worried about it. And I finally announced to them, okay, I know what's wrong. And they said, okay, tell us what's going on. And I said, it's just that life is going by too fast. And they were like,
what did
oh
you
God.
do? 6,
I
7.
was 6 or 7. Yeah. So strange. I just had this profound sense of oh my God, life ends. And why is no one bothered by it? People are just going about their lives acting normally. What is wrong with everyone? I don't know. And maybe part of me thinks if I had more experiences with people maybe dying around me, or who knows, older people in my life at that point. I mean, I had grandparents, but maybe I would have seen it differently. But because it was even especially more unknown, it was just this abstract concept of you don't get to live forever, and at a certain point you're just not going to be there, and you can't reconcile. I mean, I think Freud talks about this. It's that it creates a lot of dissonance for you as a conscient being who has, it's literally impossible for us to think about not thinking because you're still thinking, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yeah. It's that trying to conceptualize nothing. It
yeah,
just,
like
if you go too far in that loop, it's like you actually feel yourself sort of almost disappearing, and it hurts.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. And the other thing is that my parents didn't really raise us religious in any way at all. Like there wasn't even really much discussion. Like we knew that my mom had grown up Catholic, and my dad, some people in his family were Jewish, but they don't really believe in an afterlife, I think. But my dad isn't. He and my mom, like they both kind of did their own thing. And so when we were growing up, we just were very much a-religious. And I think occasionally, like a friend, we had some close family friends who would invite us to attend church occasionally. And so sometimes I'd go to like the youth group, and I found that fun as a community thing, and it was nice to hang out with people my own age. But because I hadn't been, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but let's say I hadn't been introduced to any of these ideas early on, when you're living, I think, without any religion at all, and then you go somewhere and they're like, oh, by the way, here's how everything works, and by the way, there's this God up here doing this, and you're just like, what? Like it just, I think I was like always like, wait, what? Does everyone really think this? And I just couldn't wrap my mind around it, but I could see how it like really deeply impacted some people. And so then I was like, well, why don't I feel that? And so then I did kind of try to like, well, okay, let me think about this. Maybe if some power created all of us, and okay, so then this is how it works. And then I would start thinking about the concept of eternal life. And then that kept me up at night, because I was like, oh my God, that's just as bad as death, because it goes on forever and ever. And I was like, I was like, what if I don't like it there? And anyway, it was just this whole thing. It was just not comforting at all.
In terms of belief systems, that's obviously what you're sort of touching on there. The question you said before, a point you made before about not being exposed to death that when you're younger, and like in modern society, we're distance, it's like death is sanitized in that sense. Do you think as a result of how that's changed, and we've sort of we've compartmentalized death, we've put it over here, and it's got its own little space, so it's separate from us. Do you think that we actually the global psyche suffers more from death anxiety and death denial now than it would have done, say, 100, 200 years ago, from the work you've done and looked at?
So I feel like this is a really big topic, but I don't necessarily think we suffer any more or less if death is right in our face or hidden. But I think because either way, based on most of what I've researched and studied, it seems that you, no matter what, are going to need some buffer or protective mechanism to just, as a living creature, to just cope with this knowledge and to make sense of it in some way. It's whether you use the culture to do that and that we compartmentalize it, or let's say you are seeing it all the time, you're still going to be able to sort of deal with it in some way. And you're right that most of our culture doesn't see death a lot. But I think of like people who work in hospice, or people who are in, I don't know, maybe certain medical fields where it's higher mortality rates, things like that. I'm thinking those people technically see death more. So should they be more, I guess, have better developed coping mechanisms or less denial? And most of the research doesn't seem to suggest. It's just that it takes a different form.
I don't know. It has to be processed, doesn't it? I think that's the thing. It's like we have to have a door that we open to let it in, to process it further. But if we never let it in, even if we're exposed to it, it's not going to.
I think some research that does show that there is actually benefits is, you're right, when you actually are completely intentional about processing it. And so they see that in things like certain like death reflection meditations, and people who have really chosen to try to work on it. And even then the research is a little unclear about, does that just help for like that hour that you're doing that, but then when you go back out in the world and you're in your normal life, your defenses come back. So, but I think people who, you know, I mean, like long time, like Buddhist monks and people who've spent years and years, I think can work on their like reducing defense mechanisms and things like that. But it's not the type of thing that you can just like, we are wired to not want to think about this and to defend against it. And there was actually just this recent neuroscience study, which is kind of exciting because it's the first time they've maybe found a potential neural-based mechanism for death denial. Basically, it was published in Neuroimage, I think in February of this year. And basically they found that they asked people to sort of make predictions, and they found that the prediction mechanism of the brain was lighting up in the expected way and showing the expected activity when they were asked to think about or make pairings with mortality of other people or animals or something like that. But then as soon as they had to match the predictions with their own image, I think they had like this image matching thing, the area in the brain stopped lighting up and it like didn't show activity in the way that it was before.
Wow.
Yeah. And so they were like, there's literally a lack of this activity, like it's being blocked from processing.
It's like the concept you said earlier. It's like it's almost impossible. It's like we can't anticipate it because we have no experience of it. It's like this. It's the brain can't actually process not existing.
Our own death. This is what
our own death. Yes.
Our own death. You know, we can process the other's death, but not our own, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which I mean makes sense, but it's like it's just kind of crazy that they actually found that, and it was like, wow, it really shows how much we are really wired to not think about this. And so it's no wonder that it's so hard to get people to talk about it in other contexts, or to, especially in the medical field, there's a lot of oftentimes doctors and nurses and people who work in end of life care and end of life planning. It's like impossible to get people to like write their will and to like do their advanced directive and to plan all these things that they're supposed to do, because it's like just so hard for people to like think about that. And then I think the other thing, there was this other really fun study that basically asked this really wide range of adults there was a continuum with birth on one end and death on the other. And they asked them to just put an X on that line where they feel like they are. And it was like a really wide age, like, I don't know, like 20 to 80 or something. And it was like almost, it didn't really matter how old the person was. Almost everyone put the X like in the middle. So it was just like people don't, like they can't see death as close to them. So it was really interesting.
We try to say, we need to think about death, right? Because there's benefit around that. And now what you just said is it's impossible, right? We are not wired.
That's exactly what I was about to say as well. It's like, we're done here. There's no point. It's all finished because it's just like we're trying to do something that the brain's never going to get. So let's just like...
but more than that, but no, it's not only us, because we have so much like philosophers, we have scientists, even Sheldon Solomon that we had on the show said, no, we need to do it consciously, we need to do it like so much, so it means that, is it feasible, first of all? But if it's feasible, does it mean that we need to do an effort? Like, do we need like to really constantly like, battle our wiring, as you said? That's
a really good point. Yeah, because it does beg that question. And I think that the key is like all of these studies that are I think this is, and what Freud is saying and all of these psychologists, I think the point is like our basic reaction and sort of our gut level is always going to be to like distance from it and to try to protect ourselves, because as you know, you could not spend all day thinking about death, as I found out when I was 6 years old. Like it really can just like cause a lot of debilitating anxiety. And that is actually, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's really not adaptive, because it impedes your ability to function and carry out your day-to-day tasks. So you do need to be able to, it's very adaptive to be able to not think about it all the time, despite the fact that because we have higher consciousness, it's just by virtue of being human, we are aware of this no matter what. We can't we can't just pretend, we can't even denial. It doesn't mean that we don't understand that we will die. Like, so it's this very interesting, like, this awareness that enables us to think about our own mortality is actually the very same mechanism that enables us to deny it, because that same part of our brain, which is this higher consciousness or the meta consciousness, right? Like consciousness of being conscious, that is the same part of the brain that has enabled elaborate symbolic thought, cultural systems of meaning, all of these things that we've constructed in order to make life feel meaningful and help us feel better about death. But we wouldn't need it in the first place if we didn't have that part of the brain that enables us to think about death. So it's like, to answer your question, I think it's both. I think, like, yeah, we're wired against it, but we're wired to be able to deal with it, but we really have to be, it is proactive. And I think it's never going to be a complete acceptance. I mean, I don't know, maybe again, if you're very Buddhist and you somehow get there, except there's also new research now to suggest that, like, they did, I think they looked at, like, Buddhist in different regions of I think different countries and different sects of Buddhism, and they did find that it was something like the complete opposite of what you'd expect. And it's a newer study, so they definitely need to have some follow-ups, but it was like they found that there was increased fear of death and defensiveness in certain, so it's just like, okay, well, who knows then? Like, I don't know if it's, you know, I don't think there's like one magic way, but I do think that what we know, at least from like terror management theory research about how people cope with mortality, is that there are just many, many different ways of managing terror, of terror management. And some are sort of maladaptive and some are healthier and more pro-social. And so I think the best we can hope for is just that whatever we choose to use to cope with mortality is something that doesn't hurt others and helps us with that anxiety. And that's like the best you can hope for, is what is the best possible illusion or a system or way that I can cope that helps me and doesn't harm other people. And that's that happy medium. Yeah.
I think that's where we're coming from. So even if conceptually and through the brain we can't envisage, we can't anticipate because we don't have an experience to know what it's going to be like, we can know that, at least intellectually, we can know that one day we won't be here. And
right, exactly.
we can also and we can also acknowledge our fear about that. Bless you.
Thank you.
And we are social distancing, so it's all good, right?
Yeah, we're across the screen. It's all good, guys. It's allergies, I promise.
Yes, yeah. So we can conceptualize that, and then there's also again, by acknowledging those fears, at least we can look at them to see. So what we can do is we can assess whether or not our coping mechanisms are adaptive or maladaptive. So from that perspective, there is still a benefit to looking at it and being conscious of it and being aware of it.
Totally. So well said. Yeah, exactly.
Saved us, Olivier. We're back on.
God, I was just like, okay, I was just like mailing thing, okay, shut down everything, it's over, no need to know anymore.
I think that the idea is that because maybe it's a blessing and a curse, but maybe we're gifted or cursed with this higher consciousness, but that also enables us to be introspective and to ask ourselves, what am I doing to get self-esteem right now? Or how am I coping with, what are my strategies that I'm using to derive meaning out of my own world? And is this something objectively that I'm okay with the way I'm doing this? And you can kind of check in with yourself. And of course that requires education and the time to think about these things on a deeper level. And it's not your average person necessarily that just goes about their day and is like, what are my defense mechanisms today? But I think and that's sort of why at the Becker Foundation, we're really motivated through education to just, it's, some people say, oh, that's not enough, you need to do more. But I think just the fact of understanding is a huge step. At least it's the first step. If you don't understand a problem, how are you ever gonna work with it? So just to be able to understand you know, oh, why did I have that reaction, such a strong reaction to that person who challenged my view? Why did I feel that strongly about it? Let me wait a sec, let me check myself, you know, ask myself why. And so that kind of thing I think can be really helpful, and it's like one step in conflict reduction and all these things. So like, yeah, exactly what you said, Keith. I think that's really the key, is that it's not necessarily that we can fix our brain or just make it all okay, but we're able to maybe mitigate some of the otherwise like just gut level defensiveness that we would have.
I think it's a question of choice at the end of the day, because I didn't know where I read that, but I think, is it like 90% of the time we're just like zombies, like all our actions, or is it more than that actually? All our actions are just like habits that we don't think about it. It's just like pure things that we do without even thinking. So are we just puppets, you know, because of our wiring? We just act based on programming or circuits that are in our brain? Or do we have really the choice, as you said, like just to be aware of things and just to say, no, I won't do this, but I will do something else? So is it that? Is it to have this conscious choice and make the right decisions?
Well, I think it goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, honestly. Like, yeah, in theory, all of us are capable of getting to a point where we can, I mean, maybe a lot of us, we are on autopilot a lot of the time, but if you take, you know, consciously and try to really introspect and think about things, you do have a lot more freedom and control in your life. However, if your basic needs aren't being met and you're just completely, you know, spread absolutely as thin as possible, of course, you're not going to be thinking about these higher level worldview and existential concepts if you're just trying to feed your kids or pay your rent or something, or like get shelter. Those basic things, I think it really comes back to that is well, I think that's why some people might think all this sounds, you know, kind of like navel gazy and just, and
that's I think with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, though, again, in terms of the concept that we don't, because originally it was that we don't move to the next one until we've satisfied the one below, but then that changed, didn't it? So if you think about it, so if you think about that, an awareness of what our triggers are, what our fears are, is going to change how we behave and interact with the people around us, which in turn will have a direct impact on our ability to satisfy those other needs at the bottom. So is it navel gazing, or is it actually a way of improving our ability to satisfy those other critical needs? I'm just throwing that out there as a question.
I would agree that it's not navel gazing in the ultimate goal, but the problem is that if you are kind of struggling on those lower levels, even though, yeah, you might switch between them, you're going to probably have less time than someone who is in a more secure place to be able to look back at their own behavior and defenses. So, but I think it's possible. I guess I just think it'd be, you know,
is it time though? Again, sorry, this is just to get my brain.
Yeah.
I'm thinking out loud here. Is it how much time do we need? It's more about a belief system. So it's just
that's
awareness,
a really
and
if it was in the culture more.
Yes, if it was there in the culture, and it was just we question.
That's a good point,
because ask the points. It's not about the time. It's not about sitting reading books and studying.
Oh.
We've got to live our lives. Bless you. But it's about those moments where we constantly self-reflect as we're going through the day, and those, again, the programs we have to help us respond in that moment. So
right, the cultural scripts that are already there.
Thank you. I like the way you put that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's the other thing that sometimes bothers me is there's this like academic elitism where people often think like, oh, like there's even a term lay people for describing like when you're in research and they're like, oh, put it in layperson's terms. It's like so insulting. It's so annoying. I just hate it so much. But basically there's this idea that like, oh, like we're the enlightened, like academics.
If we are the lay people, you know, right now.
It's like, oh, you peasants. Like, it's just awful. But anyway, that's literally like the accepted term, and it's even used in papers and things like that. But basically that idea that like, oh, the common man just can't really understand these like existential concepts. Like, no, that's BS. I think that every single person, from a, whatever, the trash truck driver to the CEO, like, it doesn't matter. We are all humans, and we have we're in an existential condition, and we all have that awareness of our, just those thoughts about what life means, all that stuff. We all, just literally by virtue of being human, unless you have some sort of maybe cognitive impairment, every single person knows what this feels like. And even the most quote unquote seemingly shallow people in life are
really lay people. Yeah.
really lay people. Like, again, that's just the perception, right? Because it's like, what does being shallow mean to a lot of people? Sort of blindly following like the culture and just like kind of being a sheep or whatever, or just like not, just like being only surface level, right? But what is surface level? It's like just what's being told to us, and maybe the reason they don't want to go any deeper is because they feel how scary that would be. And so they know like that, it's too painful for, so I feel like I don't buy into the fact that like, oh, that person just like doesn't get it, or I just don't buy it.
I think you're right. And if those people don't feel those things at some level, then what's the point of the non-lay people even studying what they're studying?
Thank you. That's such a good point.
Yeah, it means you're working on something that's actually meaningless and has no value, right?
Except to you, right? Except to them in their ivory tower.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
It's like, if you really don't think that they can understand, then why are you doing this research? Yeah, exactly. Yep. Or I guess they think, oh, well, they'll understand, but we have to reword it for them or whatever. But
well, look, rewording it, that's fine. It's good. It's about communicating concepts that can be difficult.
That's true. And no, yes. And I agree with that, but I just find, I take offense to that term that they use sometimes. And I understand that a lot of academia has all this jargon. And so it is necessary sometimes to be like, look, can we try to explain it in a different way that doesn't have like these terms specific, but to imply that there's like this elitism, and I think that's problematic.
Oh yeah, agreed.
Because it actually, as we know, like whatever your own personal beliefs are as a researcher and can affect the research. And so if you're coming at it from that point of view of like, I'm more enlightened and I'm more intelligent, let me study these lower people, that's going to bias your research. So
let's study the mortals. Yes.
Yes.
I would like to touch on something actually. It's based on what you just described, based on fears, the fear. Because we have this theory here with Keith, and we've discussed this with you before, Lyla. It's all fears are linked to fear of death at the end of the day.
Right. Totally. Yeah.
And it plays a lot on my job actually. I'm an executive coach, and I'm helping managers to be better, right? And it's all about behaviors. Right? Behaviors is how do we interact with their people, how can they communicate, how to be more humane, friendly, effective. And they don't behave this way because they are fearful. Most of the time they are scared of something, right? They're scared. Oh, I cannot do that because I'm scared of doing this. So at the end of the day, when I work with these people, I work with their fears, right? So I never told them, look, my friend, it's fear of death, but we touch about that, and they feel it. Oh, I'm scared. Yeah, I'm really scared. I cannot do that because something bad might happen, right?
Right, and what's the ultimate bad thing?
Yeah, and that's it, right? So, but here, I can work with them, right, to say, look, is it really bad? So we're going to this awareness piece, like we're trying to look at that from a meta perspective. So
do you get them to dig deeper and deeper and deeper?
Yeah,
I would like it arrives?
Well, I'm just trying a little bit, right?
Okay.
But I would like to have your view on that, because to me, it's important to touch these fears. If you're not aware that your behavior is driven by fear at the end of the day, and when we discover that, I'm scared of that. that's something which actually can help.
I completely, so I do think that I agree that even again, if we don't have a magic solution because it's death and there's not really a solution, even just being able to name that that's the fear, or just to acknowledge that, can actually give you power over it, or at least give you more options than maybe you thought. Some people might disagree and they might be like, well, why are you going to bring that up? Because there's just nothing they can do about that or whatever. But I think that personally in my life anyway, I feel like it's helped me, but I'm probably a little bit more of an oddball in that way than most, who is like glad, like I'm happy to think about my own defense mechanism. But I'll be, you know, when I feel like when I'm bothered by something or really worried about something, if I then try to dig down and be like, oh, right, okay, well, obviously this is just bringing up fears of my mortality, my vulnerability, all this for me, that's why it's really bothering me. Then it actually can usually, for me, it's usually like, oh, like it ties it back into this, like, oh, well, this doesn't really matter then, because really what, like, this isn't life and death. Like, it's okay. Like, you know, like, let's say I'm worried about like a piano performance and I'm like super stressed. And then, so if I like try to think about it, it's like, oh, okay, well, at the end of the day, this doesn't really matter then, because this is just gonna be what, you know, either way it'll be over, and then that's that. And like, so it usually, I think, unless it really is life and death, for me, it usually puts it in perspective to be able to dig down.
That's it. It's normalized.
In terms of the death thing, again, just the stuff that reading, just in terms of how the brain is wired, and again, we have these scripts that, if you think about from the sort of a mass sort of psyche, in that sense, is that concept of rejection is almost goes back to. It goes back to that sort of when we were hunter gatherers, nomads wandering around as part of tribes before we settled. It's like if we were kicked out of the tribe, it meant certain death, because you couldn't survive on your own. So there's tenuous it may be, but there's a link there hardwired into us, is any kind of rejection or that's why isolation is such a. I do a lot of work with companies around bullying and stuff, and isolating people psychologically is really damaging. It's that sense of rejection, and then that kicks back into all those Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all those other things, and it's all linked. So it's one of those things. So it's not about. So it's getting that understanding. It's yes, because you can say to people, go out and do the piano recital, and look, you're not going to die if it's there, but your brain doesn't understand that. There's that death fear.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's hard to get people to yeah, you're right, because it totally is. It's like that rejection or failure in that case, or messing up, and like having that, like the social repercussions is sort of in our brain akin to like a mini death. Because you're right, back in the day, that literally could mean death. And so it's become really wired into us in that way as well, that like self-esteem is a very protective mechanism, as Otto Rank and Becker and a lot of people talked about, I guess, like William James, you know, it's pretty much necessary and essential, because it's what anchors us to the world and helps us feel a sense of safety. So even though you're right, you won't literally die if you fail at that speech you were going to give or that recital, your brain might not really, it could still feel just as like grave. And also it's kind of the same thing that they say with stress research, that if you're stressed about a test or you're stressed about being chased by a lion, your brain, it's the same chemicals happening. It doesn't know the difference. Yeah. So I think it's to understand the connection, you're right, is important. And even though people might say, well, this has nothing to do with death, what are you talking about? I'm just giving a speech. But then it's explaining, well, it really is like from a long evolutionary path, it's tied in with that. And so no wonder it feels so terrifying.
And it is terror. That's the thing. And there's people that will not do something that could improve their life. They've got a 50-50 chance of it working and improving their life. And if it goes wrong, nothing will actually change. they still won't do it. It's just it's fascinating, really. Just in terms of it goes back to that emotional. It's the Daniel Kahneman stuff, the thinking fast or slow. It's those biases. It's why we make our decisions, and the fear driver underneath all of it.
yeah, not wanting to even experience that, even if it's a one-time thing that doesn't have a consequence afterward. It's just going through that is really painful for people.
I've written one sentence that you just said 5 minutes ago. You said, "I'm glad to look at my own defense mechanism," something like that. You know, I think it's a brilliant book title for your own book. You know, glad to look at my own defense mechanism. So I think it's important you do the right thing, because what you describe is it normalizes things from our conscious perspective. I'm not in danger, really. I can do it, really. What is the worst that can happen? Right? It gives us the courage to take risks. And this is what I found myself doing now. It's more about, okay, would you take the risk or not? You know, to do these steps and to confront your fear, which is what will happen. You may have this small death or a death of your identity, but you may gain something else. So it's, can we consciously fight that?
Yeah, and I think you can. But yeah, you're right. It does take oftentimes courage that maybe people might weigh it and say, oh, that's not worth it to me. Or they might, after enough times, maybe trying to like talk themselves through it and being aware of it, kind of get past it. I feel like it's also helped me a lot in like, I don't want to say just like nerve-wracking situations, but I would say in terms of like social dynamics and social situations, being aware that at all times everyone's really caught up in maintaining their self-esteem, and because as we know how important that is. But in the past, I feel like it would just bother me so much, to the point where it was just annoying to be around people. And I feel like now
lay people.
No, but like, you know, I just, especially like when you're like at a party or in groups or something, and there's just always someone just being super arrogant or just doing this or that, and it's always a self-esteem contest in groups. And I would just get exhausted by it. But I feel like when I think about it in terms of like, oh wow, everyone's really just having this human experience and they're just trying to do the best they can, because it's so, you know, it's painful to, you know, then it's like, at least I have more empathy, even if maybe I wouldn't, you know, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't date someone who's like in that mode, like very super arrogant or something, where they're really like have a high defense up for some reason. But at least I can be like, well, there's a reason. And that's, I think,
it takes
mostly
the judgment out of it, doesn't it? Which allows for compassion, and
totally,
essentially,
yeah.
which is
Massive.
Mm.
Huge, yeah. And I think that's a lot of what Becker, just in my personal life, that's what I loved about the first time I read it, was just like, it doesn't make anything okay. It doesn't make like the fact that people kill each other over ideas and that there's, you know, like power struggle and all this stuff, doesn't make any of that, like, it doesn't, or, you know, these sort of like genocides, all of that. It's not like reading that and you're like, oh, okay, great, that's why people do it. It's still horrible and tragic. I feel like
we know why now. You carry on. Yeah.
Exactly. But I do feel like, but just having that understanding though is so much more like, it's so much better than why the hell do people do that, or like how is it even possible that happened. Once you're like, okay, well, here's how it happened, then you can be like, well, okay, if we know this is sort of human tendency, human nature to potentially have these certain reactions, and then what should we make sure to like have in place or to be ready for, to mitigate. For example, like what's happening right now, the whole world is under mortality salience. Like death is really on people's minds a lot more than it usually is in our, especially in Western culture, in our very protected illusion of safety. And so we know from research that this can go two ways. You know, people can become more helpful to others, which is one avenue, but what's sometimes more likely is that people become extremely defensive of their in-group. They become more hostile towards out-groups, more xenophobic, all these things, because you're trying to isolate one common source of evil, enemy, whatever. Luckily, in this case, it's a virus. However, it did come from a specific region, and we did see an increase in xenophobia towards Asians. So it's like one of those things where it's,
and certain comments don't help with that by certain people as well.
But I mean, to their credit, I think it was at the World Health Organization that very quickly changed the name and said we need to call it something neutral, because they understood that this will have a direct result in causing xenophobia to that one region if we just name it after that region. Like, of course, and people are going to try to, because it makes people feel better to have something to blame, someone to blame. It gives control. It's when you localize the source of evil, you feel like you have control over it. So but yeah, so all of that is playing out, but it goes back to just kind of the point of like, it doesn't really make it okay. But if you understand why, it's just that one step towards, okay, like if people are going to do this, we need to take steps to mitigate. So in this case, let's rename it, because we know that people have a tendency already to do that. So we need to try to mitigate. So just what strategies are possible in that way?
Yeah, understanding the motivation behind it means people are less likely to have an emotional response against the behavior, which means there's a more calm and rational approach to dealing with it. So it doesn't mean it's okay, it needs to be dealt with, but at least it's dealt with from a place of from a grounded perspective, rather than reacting to and through judgment and attack. Instead, it comes from a place of understanding. So it's not condoning it, but it comes from a place of understanding, which makes everything much easier. I think just from a general handling conflict point of view, that's massive.
Yeah, and in research they talk about the sort of this like dual processing of threats, and there's actually the sort of, they call it like distal defense versus, why am I forgetting the other one? So the distal, so it's basically like the rational versus the sort of more like experiential gut level response. So we talk about this all the time in research, that there are these two modes that people can be in, and one is much more of this conscious, as you said, when you're consciously aware of something, you can tend to be a little bit more in a rational, sort of logical, action oriented, very like step by step. But if you're more in this experiential mode, they sometimes call it, where it's more of these emotional gut level things, then it tends to be a lot more of what we see with like just defensive behavior, or using sort of your worldview or the culture and not necessarily thinking things through on a rational level. So it's basically, and it usually in research, what it has to do with is whether or not, in the case of mortality studies, whether or not death is conscious or not. And when it's conscious, you will see more of the rational thought processes. But after, when it's, let's say not actively in someone's mind anymore, but still accessible, but maybe more subconscious, like some time has passed, so they're not directly thinking about it, that's when you see more of the very strong emotional reactions and the defensive behavior, and not so much of the consciously thinking things through.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at depthhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.